I'm Ann Lucas. I'm a longtime historian here at Monticello, also work in our development office as well, and proud graduate of the University of Virginia School of Architecture, where Richard Wilson was one of my advisors and teachers. So it's a real pleasure to welcome this distinguished panel here and to have you all here in the audience. We have, for those of us who study architecture, it's really impossible to separate Jefferson's educational pyramid, the conceptual pyramid, from his essay in architecture and his architectural plans for an academical village. We've come a long way from the days when the design of the university was attributed to real architects like William Thornton and Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Now we're apt to spend an equal amount of time debating which Ionic order was Jefferson's source, Scamozzi or Leone, and we mine Jefferson's erasures on his drawings for intent. So this afternoon, our panel will take us from the time the university was a gleam in Jefferson's eye to his plan to project the heavens on the interior of the Rotunda dome, and to the stark reality of the intersection of Jefferson's neoclassical ideal with the reality of slavery at the university. And because of that, we'll shift the order a little bit and end with Lewis Nelson's talk, because that's a nice segue into our last panel this afternoon. So let me just do a quick intro of our four speakers. Joe Lasala graduated from the University of Virginia, where he studied architecture and architectural history. He co-authored the book Jefferson's Academical Village, the Creation of an Architectural Masterpiece, with Richard Wilson. And he's working now on a multimedia database that will help us have a definitive version of Fisk Kimball's Thomas Jefferson Architect. And he's been a fellow at the International Center here working on that project. Lewis Nelson is a professor of architectural history and vice provost for academic outreach in the office of the provost. He is an award-winning teacher and author, a specialist in the spaces of enslavement in the Caribbean, in West Africa, and the American South. His most recent book is Architecture and Empire in Jamaica. Richard Wilson is the Commonwealth Professor's Chair in Architectural History at the University of Virginia. Well known as an author, especially for his studies of McKim, Mead, and White, and as the curator of important exhibitions, including two shows on Jefferson's architecture, one that just closed at the Fralin as part of the bicentennial commemoration. And finally, Doug Harnsberger, also a graduate of the university, practices as a historical architect and architectural historian. And he began working on the topic of Jefferson's dome technology when he was a student at the University School of Architecture, and it's a topic he revived as a fellow here at Monticello's International Center. So welcome to the four of you, and we'll get started with Joe.
Thank you, Anne. A little disclaimer up front. Being an architect, my presentation is going to be very visually oriented, so I'll direct your attention to the screens on the side of the room rather than to the speaker in the middle of the room. Let's see, is it the green button, I assume?
Hold on for a second.
Oh, okay. This doesn't count towards my 15 minutes, right?
No, okay. we won't hold you.
Are we all set? Okay. Thomas Jefferson believed that education was the key to the survival of the new republic that he helped to frame in 1776. And to this end, he championed a system of public education for Virginians, and the crowning achievement of his crusade was the establishment of the University of Virginia and the academical village of buildings that he designed to house the institution. Jefferson's own education was typical of an 18th century Virginia family of landed gentry. It began at home with a private tutor in the one-room schoolhouse at Tuckahoe Plantation, which still stands. At age 9, he attended a Latin school, and during his early teenage years, he attended a school in Albemarle County, where he received a thorough grounding in the classics. When he was 16, he entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, where he was exposed to the Enlightenment philosophies of one of the few instructors he admired, William Small. After 2 years at the college, he began studying law under George Wythe. And a favorite rendezvous for Jefferson, Wythe, and Small was the governor's palace, where, over food and wine, they would discuss science, philosophy, politics, and the current events of the day. Here are a few examples of the large, ugly, inconvenient, disease-ridden college buildings that Jefferson may have been referring to in his many diatribes against them. And when he warned about the tendency of these buildings to go up in flames, he wasn't just blowing smoke. Instead of a large, all-purpose building to house the entire university, Jefferson repeatedly proposed small, separate houses for each instructor, with his classroom on the ground floor and 2 rooms above for his living quarters. The students would live side by side with their professors in rooms which were connected to their teachers' schoolhouses by a covered walkway, protecting them from the elements as they moved from class to class. Of course, this wasn't the first time that Jefferson employed the architectural concept of a house flanked by single-story wings, which were topped by a flat roof that doubled as an upper-level walkway, supported by a series of brick columns that created a covered all-weather passageway. Jefferson specifically referred to the office wings flanking the president's house in Washington in a letter to the architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe when he described the dormitory colonnades that he was proposing for the university. In fact, the similarity between the White House office wings and the University of Virginia dormitories led to a nearly century-long misidentification of one of Jefferson's architectural drawings until we were able to set the record straight about 25 years ago. Instead of an 1804 study for the office wings of the president's house in Washington, the drawing turns out to be a preliminary study for a cross-section of the University of Virginia dormitories and colonnades, which we can now date to July of 1817. Fisk-Kimball dated this drawing to 1804-1805, which corresponds with Jefferson's early description of an ideal university design in his January 1805 letter, which we've already mentioned, where he recommends individual pavilions as being best suited to such a purpose. What's interesting about this floor plan is that it lacks the covered walkways in front of the pavilion and dormitory rooms, which Jefferson had repeatedly advocated in his university proposals, and which we just saw in that previous drawing that had been misidentified as the White House wings, but was actually for the university. And it turns out there's a reason why these architectural elements are missing from this drawing, and it helps solve a mystery and fill a missing link in Jefferson's educational and architectural legacy. Jefferson himself best expressed the origin of the idea of public education in Virginia when he reminisced near the end of his life about the revised code of laws that he and George Wythe had drafted in 1776 to 79. Quote, "Nobody can doubt my zeal for the general instruction of the people. Who first started that idea? I may surely say myself. Turn to the bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, which I drew more than 40 years ago, and before which the idea of a plan for the education of the people generally had never been suggested in this state." In his autobiography, Jefferson further described his proposal for a 3-tier system of public education, which would include various types of school facilities to house each level of instruction, including elementary schools at the primary level, district colleges at the secondary or middle level, and ultimately a state university at the 3rd or professional level. At the first or elementary level, Jefferson used several terms interchangeably in his bills and correspondence to describe the schoolhouses, including primary schools, elementary schools, and ward schools. In each case, however, the physical building was essentially the same, a log or wood-framed one-room schoolhouse. As for the second tier or general grade of education, Jefferson proposed several grammar schools or district colleges to be dispersed throughout the state. This secondary level of education would include among its subjects Greek, Latin, and higher mathematics. Now, I'm showing a blank slide here because according to the major published resources on Jefferson's architectural drawing, Jefferson did not leave us an architectural drawing for the second level school building, only a written description from his aforementioned education bill, where he stated that each district should build a brick or stone schoolhouse and offices, and that this schoolhouse should contain a classroom, a dining room, 4 offices for a master and usher, and about a dozen student dormitory rooms. Now, this grammar school description sounds very familiar to something we've seen before, which was identified in the catalogs of Jefferson's architectural drawings as an early study for a typical pavilion at the University of Virginia. But let's compare this drawing to Jefferson's written description of a second-level grammar school for which no drawing supposedly existed. A house of brick or stone for the said grammar school with necessary offices, a room for the school, a hall to dine in, 4 rooms for a master and usher, and 10 or 12 dormitories for the scholars. Now here is the original description of this drawing as first published in 1916. In the margin we see the title University of Virginia, Earliest Study. And in the adjacent paragraph it says Early Study for the Plan of a Pavilion and Dormitory Units without Porticos or Colonnades, University of Virginia. And here is how the same drawing is identified in Thomas Jefferson Architect, first published in 1961 and still in print today. But this is not an early study for a university pavilion at all. It's the elusive, thought-to-be-missing drawing for the second level of education in Jefferson's three-tier public education system, a regional grammar school or district college. And we can now redate it from 1805 to October of 1817 based on surviving written evidence. The lateness of that date is significant because now, instead of being a preliminary architectural study for the third level of education, the university, it instead post-dates Jefferson's university building concepts, having been drawn 3 years after he drew his architectural plans for a typical university pavilion in the summer of 1814. So it's not early or preliminary at all. It's a fully mature, thought-out design for the second level of Jefferson's three-tier system of education, complete with detailed calculations for the number of bricks needed to construct each district college and a cost estimate based on these materials. So now that we've identified the floor plans for a district college or grammar school building, unfortunately, we don't have the elevations to show us what the building would have looked like. Fortunately, though, Jefferson's brick calculations in the margin do give us some three-dimensional data in the form of wall and chimney heights. And by adding this height information to the two-dimensional lengths and widths from the floor plan, we can extrapolate a 3D model of what Jefferson's district colleges would have looked like. The one conjectural element is the shape and materials of the roof, which might have been a gable roof or a hip roof and covered with possibly wood or tin shingles. It's hard to say for sure with the limited available information. Curiously, in his education bill, where he provided us with that detailed architectural description for a second-level grammar school building, Jefferson did not provide an architectural description for the structure or structures intended to house the state university at the third level. And that's because the state university was already built. And Jefferson had even already drawn up plans for its enlargements, as you'll recall. At the time he wrote his public education bill, Jefferson naturally assumed that the College of William and Mary, then the preeminent educational institution in Virginia, would be converted into the state university. Jefferson endeavored over the ensuing years to change the curriculum of William and Mary to match the university description he had written in his bill, replacing several of the ecclesiastical subjects and their instructors with new ones from the level 3 or professional level listings. But after years of opposition to these changes, Jefferson finally abandoned his aspirations for the College of William and Mary and began to formulate a plan for a new state university of his own design, both in terms of its curriculum and architecture, and located not in Williamsburg, but more central for Virginia, in the neighborhood of his home, Monticello. In 1814, Jefferson joined the Board of Trustees for a local school called Albemarle Academy, which had first been chartered in 1803 but never got off the ground. Although Albemarle Academy was supposed to be a small district school, Jefferson had an ulterior motive to turn this into a state university. We can see the evidence of this ulterior motive in his architectural plans for the institution. Instead of the single classroom, office, dining hall building that we just saw for Jefferson's district college plan, he now instead drew a much larger arrangement of individual pavilions and student dormitory rooms around a village green, which precisely matches the description of the university that he wrote about years earlier, where he said that a university should not be a single, large, expensive building, but an academical village with small, separate houses for each professor and adjacent dormitories for their students, connected by a covered walkway. Over the next few years, Albemarle Academy evolved into Central College, a name that was deliberately chosen by Jefferson to further boost the establishment's chances of being selected as the state university. But despite the name change, the plans and the layout for the buildings remained the same. The one significant update to the design was that the once simple and identical pavilions for the professors took on a new educational function as architectural models to inspire and instruct the students who would be taught the fine arts, including architecture, as part of the expanded curriculum. As a result of this added function for the professors' pavilions, Jefferson sought outside design ideas from other architects, and their feedback led to some fortuitous additions and improvements to Jefferson's simple scheme, such as a grand domed building for the focal point of the complex. Jefferson incorporated these and other changes to his plans over the ensuing months, and eventually, taking the contours of the newly acquired site into account, the large square of 9 identical pavilions evolved into a long terraced lawn surrounded by 10 uniquely designed pavilions demonstrating the proportions and details of neoclassical architecture, capped off by a great domed pantheon at the head of the lawn, which served not as a religious temple, but a temple dedicated to education and the illimitable freedom of the human mind, the university's library. And if I had more time, I would love to delve into the individual architectural drawings and the designs for these educational temples, but my time is up, and so I will pass the baton to my esteemed colleagues who will continue with this topic of discussion in their talks. Thank you very much.
I'm very honored to be here. My talk, as you can see, Jefferson, as we know very well, had an obsession with architecture that existed on a personal and also a public level. On the personal side, this involved, of course, both luxurious living and prestige. It said who he was. He was in competition with George Washington and Mount Vernon. But his public interest involved a strong educational component. His public design, such as the Virginia State Capitol, Washington, D.C., which is on the lower right, the University of Virginia, were intended, as we've already heard, to educate the new American citizen on what was appropriate. Now, although Jefferson is frequently labeled as a, quote, classicist, and he did employ many classical elements, and he looked at many books on classical architecture, he was willing to modify and forego an interest of education. He believed that one should learn from their environment. The surroundings are part of education and convey ideas and meanings and values. In this brief talk, I'm going to explore some of these educational ideals of Jefferson and his architecture and what he hoped the buildings might accomplish. We've already heard from Joe just a minute ago, but I will go on and say that I think, in a sense, Jefferson set an architectural agenda in his notes on the state of Virginia. And he wrote, "The genius of architecture seems to have shed its maledictions over this land." And he laments the lack of trained workmen and designers. And I quote, "A workman could scarcely be found capable of drawing an order." And he suggests that perhaps a professor in a college might, and I quote, "kindle a spark that will produce a reformation in this elegant and useful art." Joe mentioned, but we also, of course, these barbarous buildings built out of brick, but for their roofs would be brick kilns. What he wants is symmetry and taste. This is again from the notes, and to avoid the burden, and I quote, "of barbarous ornament, sometimes found in the more expensive buildings." Soon after completing the notes, Jefferson was in France and wrote in 1785 to James Madison explaining the design for the new Virginia State Capitol, which he drew up with the assistance of the French antiquarian architect Charles Louis Clearasil. Jefferson writes to Madison, and this is repeated in another letter as well, and I quote, "But how is a taste in the beautiful art to be formed in our countrymen, unless we avail ourselves of every occasion when public buildings are to be erected, of presenting to them models for their study and imitation?" He goes on and he explains that the plans and the model, which he had just sent across the Atlantic, were more than just a governmental building, but their purpose was, and I quote, "to improve the taste of my countrymen." And I'm quoting, "to improve the taste of my countrymen, to increase their reputation, to reconcile with the rest of the world, and to procure them its praise." He explains very carefully to Madison, "We took for our model what is called the Maison Carrée at Nimes, one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful and precious morsel of architecture left to us by antiquity." Just 3 years later, after sending the plans back, he wrote up his hints to Americans traveling in Europe, which was written in 1788. And he explains in these hints that as the country will grow, many new buildings will be needed and to be designed. And consequently, and I quote, "It is among the most important arts," this is architecture, "it is among the most important arts and is desirable to introduce taste into an art which shows so much," end quote. On painting and sculpture, he explains, "too expensive for the state of wealth among us. It would be useless, therefore, and preposterous to make ourselves connoisseurs in these arts. They're worth seeing, but not studying." Now, needless to say, as we all know, Jefferson would return to the young republic and become very involved as Secretary of State in Washington's administration in the design of Washington, D.C., including the overall plan for Washington, D.C., and his suggestions for the major public buildings, such as we see here on the left is the Capitol, or one of his schemes for the United States Capitol, and on the right is his scheme for the President's Mansion. He also, of course, is very involved in other things such as popular forests and gave lots of advice to his friends here in the Piedmont. All you had to do was just to call him up on your cell phone, and there would become the advice to you. And finally, the design of the University of Virginia. As Joe just has explained, the design of the University of Virginia is a long and a very complicated process that took many years and went through these many different names and incarnations: Albemarle Academy, Central College, and finally the university. I am showing you here now. This is his letter to Dr. William Thornton, and almost exactly the same letter was sent to Benjamin Henry Latrobe, that he writes to them, and he asks that he wants, and you can read it very carefully in there, but he says that he wants the fronts of these pavilions to be models of taste and good architecture and a variety of appearance, no two alike, so as to serve as specimens for the architectural lectures. So the fronts of the pavilions are to be each one different. Now, of course, one of the reasons why he is writing this letter, both to Thornton and Latrobe, is that he had just sold almost all of his books to the Library of Congress, and he did not have them. Being a good bibliomaniac, he went right out and began buying the books again and so forth. But what he is looking for is he's looking for ideas. What I will now show are some of the images of the fronts of the pavilions, and note their differences and what it is we might think that Jefferson was attempting to teach with the varied facades. At the same time, I ought to note that this isn't something that I think can be absolutely explained in words. This is something that has to be viewed and looked at. I'm sure all of you have walked up and down the lawn 10 times, 20, 100, 300 times. But I do have to admit that I've done it only 2,000 times. But that there is something new that actually comes to me each time that I see it. It isn't something that just like that you grab the thing, that you grab the thing and you see it. Don't worry, I'm not going to do every damn pavilion, but still at the same time to just note, of course, the differences that you have here between Pavilion 1 and Pavilion 2, which are directly across from each other. He is very, very insistent in these. And I'm showing you, these are two of the drawings, and you can see, I hope, a little bit on the one on the left for Pavilion 1. This is in the back of the drawing up there. There is he says what it is, and this would be the Baths of Diocletian. On Pavilion 2, which is the drawing on the right, and these drawings do vary, and not everyone is exactly the damn same thing. But on the one on the right, it's a temple of Fortuna Virilis in Rome. And so he's choosing each of these differently. I also ought to note that on these pavilion drawings that the numbers do change, that there is a variation, and this gets into a too complicated story of some of the changes, because they originally all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one down one side, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 down the other side, and then he flips the thing back and forth just to confuse you, I think. But as you can see here, we do have those elements that are there. And of course, then when we move in close on them, we can begin to see this type of details that we're looking at here. The Doric of Diocletian's baths is the one that is going to be on your left. And then on the right, the Temple Fortuna Virilis in Rome is, Diocletian's baths on the left, the Temple Fortuna Virilis is on the right. And there is this type of variety, and one can focus in on this because this becomes one of the sort of obsessions that architectural historians love to have. But still, at the same time, it does seem to me, and this goes into the question of what it is that we are seeing there, that there are a couple of other things that might be said. As I mentioned earlier, he is willing to break the rules. He knows the rules, and then he breaks the rules. And there is one thing that is absolutely wrong with the lawn, and that is this variety. You shouldn't have these different things up and down the lawn. Each one should be the same. And I've had the good pleasure, or the agony, depending on how you want to say it, of taking some eminent Frenchmen around, and they look at it and say, this is wrong. This shouldn't be this way. Well, I can't help it. That's the way the damn thing was done. But so what is it that's going on? And while we can get into the different details and so forth that come out of the different books, and there is a dialogue that's going on. On one hand, it is Palladio, and always across from it will be a French book, Friart de Chambray. Now, what does he mean by putting these two across from each other? Well, again, it's a 3 o'clock in the morning conversation with him, and I still haven't gotten the exact answer. But it's very clear, and of course we can play a little game on this, put the numbers in the hat and pull them all out. But there is this variety, and there are always these that are in conflict. What there is, I think one can say that there is some sort of a dialogue that's going on. And what he's presenting is not just simply the different architectural elements, but he's suggesting there's the different sorts of facades that you might want. And for instance, number 7, which is the one on the left in both of these, which is the first one, and is based to some degree on the drawings that Dr. William Thornton had sent in, though with some variety. But still at the same time, it also presents a different type of a public facade. And one of the things I think is forgotten for us today is that the arcade at the ground level was very much a public type of an element. It wasn't just something convenient, that it was very much of a public element that existed. In other words, what we do have here is that we have this variety. It's almost Heinz 57 varieties. Which one is it that you want? Which one is it that you want to choose? He is giving this type of an option. And so it is with that that I think that I better stop, and you can make your choice yourself. Thank you.
Joe and I were comparing notes this morning, and both of us are architects, and not a coincidence, we're heavily visually oriented, so if you'll bear with me, there are a number of slides that I want to get through quickly, so I'll direct you to the screens and away from the podium. I'm going to be talking about the Delorme dome of the Rotunda from 1824 at the University of Virginia. Specifically, my talk will focus on 2 educational pursuits that fired Jefferson's imagination in the last decade of his life. The first is as a university curriculum planner. Jefferson sought to design a curriculum that reflected his Age of Enlightenment ambition to include the advanced study of the universe through the applications of the mathematical sciences and, most importantly, astronomy. His desire to establish a strong astronomy curriculum at UVA prompted him to create a detailed sketch of a boom lift contraption that you've never seen before. And I'll attempt to analyze that for you in a few minutes. Secondly, Jefferson was a lifelong educator of architects and builders. He enjoyed sharing his mastery of building technologies, no more so than when he was teaching others how to employ this 16th century method of Delorme dome construction. This clever invention of the French Renaissance architect Philippe Delorme occupied his attention for the last 40 years after he first saw it as a 42-year-old ambassador to France with Maria Causeway. I will share some examples when Jefferson acted as a private tutor to teach his favorite builders, Dinsmore and Nielsen, how to assemble the Rotunda's Delorme dome in 1823. This quote I thought was useful from Johann Kepler because he's remarking that the inventions of scientists are just as interesting as the science itself, and I think that applies well to this contraption that we'll be seeing in a minute. So at the age of 78, late in his life, 1821, that's a portrait by Scully, Jefferson is designing in the summer of 1819 a novel used for the Rotunda's dome room. And he sketches a plan that I will describe here. Within the centerpiece structure of his academical village, he imagined that the dome room would be utilized as a planetarium-like classroom for teaching astronomy. Jefferson considered astronomy to be the most sublime of the 8 natural philosophies that he listed for his new university's curriculum. The blackboard for this astronomy classroom would be the inner concave of the dome itself. The plaster surface of the dome would be painted a vivid sky blue and be arrayed with constellations of gilded stars in the shape of half spheres. Each star would be attached to the dome surface with masonry cement, positioned according to the most accurate celestial coordinates of the time. So this supersized spherical coordinate system would be a mapped grid, longitude and latitude, on the dome itself, drawn across the concave of the dome. Jefferson further imagined that his astronomy professor would position hundreds of stars and planets on this oversized star chart as he lectured the students from high above. In essence, the dome's concave would serve as an enormous astronomical blackboard to support the professor's lectures in celestial cartography, the plotting of all known and newly discovered stars and planets. That is one of the sketches that Jefferson did, along with a set of 2 pages of notes about this astronomical laboratory that he was inventing. This is an image of the Ensinga Planetarium in Franeker, the Netherlands. It was built in 1774. I have no evidence that Jefferson ever saw this, but I thought it was coincidental that you see a blue background on the planets and gilded stars. So somewhere in the discussion of what planetariums look like, this model might have been known to Jefferson. It certainly is relatively accurate given his description. So how is an astronomy professor to elevate 35 feet above the dome room to position by hand each of these gilded stars? To achieve this Peter Pan levitation, Jefferson had a novel idea: to fabricate a 35-foot long oak boom with a saddle attached on the end of it. And in the middle of his narrative describing the classroom, he drew a diagram. I skipped by that diagram, but I'll continue, of the hoisting mechanism. And one surmise is that he came up with this idea to use a horse saddle based on his daily riding routine around the Monticello plantation. It was a favorite device of his to move around. He then goes on to describe how the operator would mount up on a common saddle with stirrups, be hoisted vertically on the long oak boom lift via a rope and pulley system to the full height of the oculus of the dome room. Then the operator would pivot across the concave surface of the dome with the able assistance of students below, pulling ropes and boomed in the desired direction. What could possibly go wrong? One can further imagine how the operator would have been subjected to the playful mischief of the students in charge of the ropes and pulleys. This is a sketch that I prepared to show the relationship of the boom and the saddle at the top of this boom, with a pulley elevated, attached to the oculus, and the rope hanging down in the middle. So that's my sense of how this would be accomplished. In order for this to work, he would have had to raise the floor 10 feet above the final elevation of the floor. So clearly this didn't come to be. But a cartoon artist for the UVA magazine took up this idea. I provided him this vision of a man on a horse with a boom lift as a starting point for his cartoon, and he generated this cartoon for the UVA magazine in 2012 to indicate the highly risky scenario of this elevated instructor. So was Jefferson's hoisting mechanism essentially too unwieldy and dangerous? I suspect so. Was the idea of working off a huge and elevated celestial blackboard too controversial for practicing professors of astronomy? Possibly. Or was the central light-filled oculus of the dome room a major impediment to making a successful 19th century planetarium room sufficiently dark? These are all good questions. No one knows why Jefferson abandoned these ideas in 1818, but 3 months later, he wrote a follow-up set of notes that illustrated a classical colonnade and a balcony encircling the room with a room label of library attached. With that abrupt change in the intended use of the dome room, Jefferson's avant-garde astronomy classroom became a largely forgotten footnote in the architectural history of the university. During my research fellowship in April 2012, I was surprised to come across these 2 pages of handwritten notes and transcribed them while I was at the library and presented them to Jeff Looney, who's here today. And this was an unofficial transcription at the time, but I understand it's been officially transcribed since then. And Jeff wrote these words back, which I would like to quote to you. Jefferson's initial intention to use the concave of the Rotunda dome to map the northern heavens and teach astronomy grew out of his own abiding interest in astronomy and was central to his grand vision for the theoretical and practical study of natural philosophy at the University of Virginia. The mathematical sciences in general and astronomy in particular were seen by Jefferson and his peers as the culmination in the education of an enlightened man, the most direct way to perceive God through the sublime workings of his unchanging physical laws on an unimaginable grand scale. The installation of a planetarium at the highest point of the university's most imposing building would thus have had immense symbolic significance for Jefferson and for the students at the institution to which he devoted his last years. Now I would quickly like to cover the other piece of this. Jefferson is educator and builder, educator to builders and architects that he knew as a tutor. In contrast to his public role as the primary curriculum planner, Jefferson was also the personal tutor for several American neoclassical architects and builders. He was first introduced to the Delorme dome at the Lasala in Paris in 1786 in the company of the beguiling Maria Causeway. There she is in her beguiling self. Jefferson had a 40-year correspondence with Maria, so it was an important part of his mature life story. And he wrote his famous head and heart letter to Maria the following week after he had broken his wrist in his enthusiasm that day to vault over a fence that he didn't quite vault over entirely. So the important thing to take away from this story is that Jefferson described the Lasala as the most superb thing on earth. He was transfixed by the light that came in through the skylights into the grain market in the interior. Had dazzling skylights coming down from the oculus. It was 140 feet in diameter, the largest Delorme dome ever built. The radiating skylights obviously created a memorable experience for him that I believe he worked on replicating in the sense of the exhilarating experience of being in that space for the next 40 years. So before he left Paris, he purchased Delorme's treatise of 1561, so it's almost 200 years old. It is 200 years old. It's 223 years old at the time of his purchase. Nouvelles inventions pour bien bâtir, or New Inventions for Building Well. He was the only American to have Delorme's treatise, of course. So he became Delorme's disciple when he came back to this country. Some images of the Lasala. Here's an image from Delorme's treatise showing the laminated ribs and the method of staggering slender boards of oak in a laminated pattern to achieve a very strong construction. It gave the full height of the room to the construction. The cross-section of these Delorme domes was between 12 and 16 inches for a room that vaulted 140 feet in diameter. Another illustration from Delorme. So, the first American Delorme dome was Monticello, his personal essay at Monticello. He did the drawings when he was still minister to France, and he brought it back and immediately produced this. Well, not immediately, it was going up in 1801, but it was the first essay in Delorme in this country, 1801. Robert Mills shows up, the young 20-year-old student, to learn about classical architecture from Jefferson's library. Jefferson hands him Delorme's treatise, asks him to do a drawing of a gentleman's house, and in the cross-section of the dome, all that construction that you see in the dome section is Delorme's method. So it's a very one-to-one correlation. Jefferson is teaching Mills Delorme's method as a young student. And Mills goes off to design 5 auditorium churches up and down the eastern seaboard in the next 10 years. This one happens to be in Philadelphia, the Sansom Street Baptist Church. And finally, well, not the last surviving of these 5 is the Monumental Church. So Mills becomes, second to Jefferson, the most prolific of the Delorme dome builders. All these saucer domes that were built for these churches appeared in 10 years. And then his friend Latrobe also gets in on the act. And Latrobe has a correspondence with Jefferson back and forth at the U.S. Capitol about building in Delorme's method, the House of Representatives. He does that and comes back, and for the essay at the Baltimore Cathedral, produces an exterior Delorme dome. This shot shows you the skylit panels at the top of the dome and the central nave, of the Baltimore Cathedral. But the interesting point here is that those skylights are fairly close to the Aloe skylights themselves. So it's a very strong correlation between Jefferson's vision of Delorme and what Latrobe is producing in Baltimore. Finally, and this is the most important thing I wanted to cover today, the exhibit that just closed at the Museum of Jefferson's drawings for the university did not include this drawing, but I would submit that it's one of the most important drawings of Jefferson's efforts at the university. It looks like, and can be confused with, a skylight, perhaps, and that was the way it was falsely identified by a couple of scholars until recently. It is actually a framing plan for Jefferson's Delorme dome at the Rotunda. And in measuring it carefully, you find it scaled at 1 foot equals 20 feet. It's not a usual scale, but it is an engineering scale. It's scaled quite intentionally by Jefferson, and it is a very intentional drawing to show all of the ribs, the purlins, the retaining ring, the oculus, all the details that you would need to build the dome. And in analyzing it, you find out that there's a very unusual and illogical methodology that Jefferson used in laying it out. So I won't get into all those details except to tell you that there are primary ribs and secondary ribs and tertiary ribs, 56 tertiary ribs and 112 quaternary ribs. There's all these ribs that, from that drawing in the bottom right, I've put together a construction drawing for the reconstruction of the Delorme dome at the Rotunda. This is just an academic exercise. I don't want to get anybody worried about this possibility. In the restoration of the dome, the Guastavino tile that was installed by Stanford White is quite sound and is not going anywhere. So this is just to point out that this was a major design element of Jefferson's effort at the Rotunda, and it's his signature that he contributed at the age of 79 with arthritic wrists. And from this drawing, we have done a student project this spring at the university's architecture school to generate what I'm calling a half-dome framing of the plan of the Rotunda that shows the oculus in red in the middle, and it's like a half shell that you would see in a symphony setting. But it is a framing plan to celebrate the detailing and the methodology of Jefferson's work. And that's a plan drawing of it, and this gives you a three-dimensional idea. We were toying around it when we created these renderings, what scale to build it at, and ultimately we built it at the lower scale. It's a 1/3 scale drawing, 25 feet in diameter. The largest is the full scale, 75 feet, which is what the Rotunda dome room is today. So I'll close by saying that this whole idea was generated by the recognition that we have a bicentennial in progress, that there is an effort here to suggest that the celebration of Delorme should include some reference to the heavens, the astronomy laboratory that Jefferson envisioned should be told as part of this story, even if it can't be physically referenced in the Rotunda room today. It ought to be referenced in the record that this was his intention until he couldn't figure out how to make the saddle safe and the students from playing with it. So in closing, I'll say that the beam that's shown here in the reference is a reference to Jefferson's hallowed Rotunda dome room when it was programmed to assume its highest and best use, not as a quiet library, but rather as an avant-garde planetarium and classroom where students would be given the latest insights about the cosmos, or as the sage himself put it, learn how God's clock works in sublime harmony. Thank you.
Jumping right into my talk, I'm going to be working to transition from this session into the next, focusing specifically on the spaces of slavery at the University of Virginia. And this is a result of a long ongoing project initiated by many people in the room, not myself. And I've been able to think about how do we bring an architectural and a spatial lens to a lot of these questions. The pavilions of the Academical Village are among the most well-studied buildings in early America. Much of this stems from the unusually articulate intentions of their designer, as you've already heard. The pavilions were to be used as models of chaste and correct architecture, and of a variety of appearance no two alike, so as to serve as specimens for the architectural lecturer. In studying the architecture of the pavilions, students would come to learn the fundamentals of the classical orders, and they could study in 3 dimensions, details from antique Roman models like the Baths of Diocletian or the Temple of Fortuna Virilis. But the university's pavilions were also collections of spaces designed by Jefferson to support the everyday life of professors and their families. In addition to being columns and capitals, the pavilions were also bedchambers and passages, dining rooms and kitchens. This paper is an attempt to think through Thomas Jefferson's pavilions not as forms, but as spaces, and in so doing to discern his evolving understanding of the spaces of slavery required to run his academical village. The design for the University of Virginia built on Jefferson's many decades of architectural experiments in a slave society. In these, he determined how best to mask slavery by creating separate public, private, and enslaved zones in buildings and in landscapes. For example, just as he took office as the governor of Virginia in the 1770s, Jefferson began a series of sketches for the remodeling of the governor's palace. And you can see the original floor plan on the left and Jefferson's plan on the right. Jefferson's unbuilt designs include the insertions of service passages that would have allowed for the movement of enslaved domestics into and through the governor's residence without having to use the main entrances or pass through public entertaining rooms. When he redesigned Monticello after his return from France, he made similar alterations. The design for the house very clearly demarcated distinct zones, public, private, and for the enslaved for service. The entry hall, parlor, and dining rooms were the public spaces of the house where he received visitors. These were aligned along one bent axis of the house, and along the other end were the private rooms, including his suite, referred to by one of his grandchildren as the sanctum sanctorum. In these wings were transverse hallways, generally not visible from the public rooms, where the enslaved could move unseen in order to do the work expected of them. These hallways connected to the stairs that led down to the service level, where the kitchens, storerooms, stables, and other service rooms were located. The changes he made at Monticello to mask slavery were most obvious in the dining room, where he installed a number of devices that allowed him to diminish the number of enslaved attendants necessary to wait on table. He installed shelves mounted on a revolving door so that food could be placed there and then brought into the room by a trusted enslaved servant. He also made use of an elevator to transport wine from the cellar and used standing carts, called dumb waiters, to receive dirty dishes, again diminishing the number of enslaved workers necessary for serving meals. The intent of these changes were not lost on visitors. Margaret Baird Smith, who dined at Monticello in 1809, noted that when Jefferson wished to enjoy a free and unrestricted flow of conversation, he placed a dumbwaiter near every diner, so as to make the attendance of servants entirely unnecessary, believing as he did that much of the domestic and even public discord was produced by the mutilated and misconstrued repetition of free conversation at dinner tables by these mute but not inattentive listeners. Smith clearly grasped the significance of Jefferson's designs. Conversations at Jefferson's dinner table were often political in nature, and by diminishing the number of enslaved people at the table, it meant that fewer were able to overhear the news of the day. And the news of the day, such as the discussions of outlawing slavery that surrounded the Missouri Compromise of 1820, were news that slaveholders might wish to keep from their enslaved. Importantly for his later work at the university, Jefferson also manipulated Monticello's landscape to mask the visibility of labor performed by his enslaved workforce. Famously, his entire row of domestic service spaces, including kitchens, smokehouses, and stables, and some quarters, were buried in the embankment below the level of the main house. As a result, these spaces were entirely invisible from the pleasure gardens above, where Jefferson entertained his guests. And as he turned to the challenge of designing his new university, in the closing years of his life, Jefferson brought with him decades of experience designing in the particular context of a slave-dependent society. When Jefferson approached the design for his academical village, he employed a similar strategy, manipulating both the architecture and the topography in order to create separate zones for free and enslaved. The front face of the buildings on the lawn were primarily intended for faculty and students. The faculty, of course, were to live up in the upper story of the pavilions where they could connect with one another via the upper story walkway. Students were expected to reside in the dormitory rooms on the lower lawn and the range, and to take classes either in the rotunda or in the ground floors of the pavilions, and to dine in hotels. And the enslaved domestic workers were hidden from view, expected to inhabit the basements of pavilions and hotels and the walled gardens behind. Jefferson's architectural designs separated education from work, free from enslaved. Since the earliest depictions, the university was represented as a series of building facades, pavilions marching up the terraces to the rotunda at its north end. These images were generally unpopulated, representing the university as an architectural abstraction, an intellectual and educational ideal. Behind those pavilions were large spaces that are today referred to as gardens. In the earliest images of the university, in the earliest plan of the university, called the Maverick Plan, created before the university was completed, the gardens were bounded by a serpentine wall. In the Maverick Plan, these spaces are blank. Today, they are filled with geometric walkways and ornamental trees and shrubs, pleasure gardens akin to those at European estates. But these mid-century pleasure gardens are historically inaccurate. These spaces, of course, were intended to be primarily utilitarian. They were central to the life at the academical village. These were work yards where enslaved laborers were expected to live and labor for the faculty and the students at the university. In these spaces, enslaved African Americans grew food and prepared it. They raised and butchered animals. They washed laundry. They chopped wood. And they struggled to build lives and families. Census data makes clear the very large population of enslaved African Americans who lived in the academical village. Yet it is difficult to identify who they were or to obtain an exact count because institutional and state records are far from comprehensive. Virginia's decennial census numbers suggest that the population of enslaved people was between 125 and 200 at any one point in time over these 50 years. Overlaying the census data onto an 1858 plan of the academical village, and I think I've picked 1830 for this one, offers a unique perspective on the numeric distribution of African Americans across the spaces of the university. There was great variability. Some of the faculty owned a sizable number of people, while others owned only a few. The hotel keepers owned the most. But there were also many people who were owned by local businesses whose work regularly brought them to the university. And after the students themselves, enslaved African Americans were the second largest population residing within the academical village. Having already designed numerous private residences in Virginia, especially his own house on the mountaintop at Monticello, Jefferson knew that the pavilions would need a kitchen and some accommodations for the enslaved people. These were essential components for any antebellum Virginia household. Unusually, however, Jefferson placed the cook kitchen for each of the pavilions and the hotels in those buildings' cellars. In the American South, kitchens were normally housed in exterior buildings in order to reduce smell, heat, smoke inside the residence, but also to reduce the risk of fire. By locating the kitchens in the cellars of the pavilions, Jefferson not only took advantage of the natural slopes on either side of the lawn, he also hid both the people and their work to be done partially underground, a strategy he had already successfully deployed at Monticello. Jefferson placed, how do I go back? The little red one? Jefferson placed the kitchen in the cellar of Pavilion 7, which is the floor plan that you see produced by Jefferson on the left, the first building on the lawn. In his design, however, he paid very little attention to the necessary conveniences of cooking. And the kitchen floor plan is the one on the bottom right. As a largely subterranean space, the kitchen, which is the large room to the top of that plan, had little ventilation or light, as the only source of natural light was a single door which gave access to the rear workyard. And the limited natural light made available to the cook was better than the other two rooms in this cellar, both of which were fully subterranean. The only natural light for these two rooms would be through the open exterior kitchen door when it stood open. The pavilions he would design soon thereafter, and this argument results from basically putting the plans for the pavilions in chronological order and understanding Jefferson's expanding conception of how these kitchens actually functioned over the course of his design process. The pavilions he designed soon thereafter, and I think I've got Pavilion 3 on the right, offered greater conveniences for cooking and accommodation than did his first, which is Pavilion 7. And the kitchen, the subterranean floor, cellar floor is in the top left of the plan on the right. With the addition of windows, these kitchens now had more natural light. These cellars also included a large additional chamber called a servants' hall, and you can see that in that same plan. One Professor McGill described that chamber as a comfortable room for all the servants. The servants' hall was likely intended to serve multiple communal purposes, such as sleeping, dining, and other necessaries of daily life. Despite McGill describing it as comfortable, in reality, these rooms were often dimly lit and frequently damp. Even just after a few years after construction, the university's Committee on Inspection resolved that the cellar of Pavilion 5 had to be made dry by draining the same. Subterranean, dark, and often wet, these basement spaces were intended by Jefferson as kitchens and other accommodations for slaves, hidden away from view from the students in the academical village. The pavilions on the east side of the lawn, the west side was built first and designed first, the east side was designed later. The pavilions along the east side were built later, and in these, Jefferson appears to have paid greater attention to the actual work expected of the pavilions intended enslaved occupants. The cellar of Pavilion 4 included 5 rooms with a large kitchen, 2 fully subterranean spaces that were intended probably for food storage, and 2 other well-lit chambers. One of these rooms was a private interior chamber with abundant southeastern light and the warmth of a corner fireplace. Lucy Cottrell was the likely first occupant of this chamber. Professor George Bladerman purchased her along with her mother Dorothea and their extended family from Jefferson's estate. Lucy probably served as a cook for the professor and his family, and her bedchamber had direct access to the large kitchen, which was lit by 2 windows, one at each end of the north and south of the room. As cook, Lucy probably also held keys to the unlit and unventilated pantries that opened into the kitchen, which would have been used to store valuable cooking supplies like flour, salt, and sugar. One of the greatest shortfalls in Jefferson's design for the academical village was the lack of accommodations for enslaved domestics. Even though Jefferson had eventually provided servants' halls and sometimes even a private chamber for a specialized cook and her family, there was precious little space allocated for the many other enslaved laborers. Furthermore, faculty and hotel keepers were not pleased that the space that was provided was often located in cellars. They complained that these basements were damp and unhealthy. The environment was thought to promote disease. The keeper of Hotel D, George Spotswood, wrote of his concern for his cellar space that it will always be unhealthy. Had I a cabin built for the reception of my servants after they had done the duties of the day required thereto, I should be in more comfort and my servants more healthy. Almost immediately after Jefferson's death, faculty submitted a series of requests for alterations to their pavilions and gardens. Without delay, Professors Emmett and Dunlanson in Pavilions 1 and 10, respectively, applied for the construction of separate living quarters in their yards for their enslaved domestics. By September, both buildings were under construction. The following month, the Board of Visitors issued a policy expanding the offer to all faculty in the pavilions and to the keepers of the hotels. By 1832, two-room quarters stood behind every single pavilion at the university. The slope of the land, especially that to the east, meant that there was also additional cellar space under the lawn rooms that were used at times to provide private chambers for enslaved people. These rooms were small, they had low ceilings, and they had no windows or light unless the door was left ajar. These would have been miserable accommodations. Now, there's no official record of this claim, but as with other information about slavery, oblique references in the documents make clear that these rooms were regularly used as housing. As early as 1828, for example, student Gessner Harrison communicated in a letter that washing and cooking, for him, could be done by a woman who is the wife of a man who occupies my cellar. As our research into slavery at the university has progressed, it has become increasingly clear the many ways in which the early university was similar to a southern plantation landscape. With newly built kitchens and smokehouses, washhouses in the garden enclosures, and its large enslaved population, the academical village closely resembled other mid-century plantation landscapes across Virginia. Jefferson's design had attempted to obscure the role of slavery by placing most of these workspaces in the cellars of pavilions and hotels. It was a conscious attempt to visually minimize the physical presence of the laboring black body in his idealized landscape of a university. But this vision collapsed almost immediately. Slavery spilled out of the cellars to fill the yards and gardens behind. And since most of these spaces are no longer visible in their original forms, it takes some imagination to repopulate this landscape with a large number of enslaved African Americans who lived and labored there daily. Cooks spent long days in the poorly lit and often damp and certainly hot cellar kitchens. Some were moved into more well-lit and newly built kitchens in the gardens after about a decade. Men and children labored to chop wood and to gather water from the cisterns and wood piles that filled the yard. At the end of the day, only a few retired to a private chamber to sleep. The vast majority slept in lots of 4 to 8, in lofts above washhouses and exterior kitchens, or bunks in subterranean servants' halls, or on the brick floor of a kitchen. These are the spaces that shaped everyday life for the vast majority of the enslaved African Americans who lived and died at the University of Virginia. Thanks.
All right, let's have any questions.
One of the speakers, I think the last one, mentioned both Emmett and Douglason, and I believe those two professors and one or two others wrote a number of letters complaining about the space, to the point. To the point that one might infer there was a certain hostility to humanity, not just for the slaves, but for the professors, an absence of closets, an absence of other storage space, no access to the attic. Could you comment on that? Is that a fair comment that the design wasn't as perfect for the occupants?
Wow, that's a big question. And actually, I'll ask Richard to step in and answer that one as well. It seems to me that the numbers of alterations that are made to buildings soon after occupation suggest that they, in fact, were not ideal by their initial, were not understood to be ideal by their their initial residents. This is particularly true by staircases that are inserted to allow access into operable attics in both pavilions 1 and 10, reworkings of cellars soon after they are occupied. I can't really think of significant changes to the interior floor plans of buildings immediately after occupation, with one exception of a professor who's occupying Pavilion 2, who builds a transverse wall that blocks view from his dining room out onto the lawn. And he's raising 2 young girls, and there's an inference that he's trying to raise these girls in virtue and views from the dining room out onto the bad behavior of the students on the lawn is something that he actually visually wants to block. But that's just really a kind of one-liner for one wall. I think it's, I mean, yes, there's going to be complaints. They're also coming from Europe to remote Albemarle County. There's all kinds of reasons to complain. But I can't think of significant physical evidence that would suggest that they were fundamentally discontented with their spaces.
Just to follow up.
Yep.
The problem with the leaking roofs. And that possibly being a factor in driving Dr. Douglinson to Baltimore. And
So the leaky roofs are primarily over the students' rooms. How many of the, do any of the pavilions initially have a flat roof?
No.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
One, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
yeah.
So most of the pavilions are, don't have the kind of complicated zigzag roof system that he's putting over. So that's primarily inflicted on the students, not on the faculty.
But it's also on pavilion number 10, the way that the attic was put on there, it was sitting right on the roof, and so you collected all your water and all of the junk back there, and it just seeped right in. But then just to follow, that it comes at a point, the initial pavilion, like number 7, was one big room downstairs, and you got 2 rooms upstairs, and that was it. It didn't work. And so about halfway through, he begins to shift the thing to a central entrance hall, with one side is classroom, the other side is the parlor. And so the professor does have a downstairs space, get some more space.
Thank you. My question is for the first 2 speakers. So the loggia in Bologna, it reminds me, or vice versa, the academic walkway, the pathway at UVA reminds me of the loggia that you find in Bologna, right, at the University of Bologna. And I don't think Jefferson ever got to Bologna, but is there any record of him having studied that passageway that you find in the city of Bologna, the arched walkways that connect all of the parts of Bologna for practicality and aesthetics?
Yeah, I think primarily anything that has to do with architecture in Italy, Jefferson gets from books. He has multiple editions of Palladios, 4 books showing several buildings and palazzos and different public buildings. And he does use the term loggia, in fact, in one of his pavilion designs. I believe it's Pavilion 8, which has a little recess at the entrance, and he refers to that as the loggia of that particular pavilion. So he's familiar with the terminology and the architectural forms, but not necessarily having seen them in person on one of his European excursions, but probably more likely from seeing them in a book.
As far as I know, no, he did not get, he got to Milan and Turin, and that was it in Italy. However, there are I think, models that can be found in especially English universities and French universities or colleges. And in particular, he does visit Oxford. He doesn't say, excuse me, a damn thing about it. But we do know that he's there. And if you do investigate a couple of the older colleges, the way that they were set up, the professors were up above, and they had their connections around, and the students were down below.
Was it customary for the students to bring servants, and if so, where were they housed?
Jefferson did not allow students to bring their own personal slaves or servants to the university. which is one of the reasons that necessitated the hotel keepers to own such a large population of enslaved people to provide all the various services that individuals would have expected. But we do know that many students are actually breaking those rules by bringing individuals and having them housed in town and elsewhere. And so the official rules of the university said that you couldn't, but we do know that there are examples of students that do.
I think we have a question over here.
Thank you. In the second-tier housing that was pictured for the college level, there seemed to be a striking similarity to George West's floor plan of the public spaces to that of the secondary spaces. And I was wondering if Jefferson ever reflected on the fact of his education within that space, or if you saw a similarity as well.
Well, I'm glad you noticed that too, because that's something that I saw as well, that the domestic character of his school designs. There's no direct, as far as I know, there's no direct reference in his correspondence or his building notes that specifies using that particular home or any other specific house as a model for the floor plans. But the concept is definitely there, and you noticed it, I noticed it. It's very evident that he's using a domestic template for his schoolhouse designs.
Elise?
This is mainly for Professor Nelson.
Yes.
Mainly for Professor Nelson, okay. One of the slides that you put up of the academical village had circles with kind of a ratio, I guess, of enslaved to non-enslaved.
Yep.
I noticed that Pavilion 7, I didn't notice a comparison.
Right, so Pavilion 7 is actually the pavilion that is occupied, it's sort of occupied as the official university management pavilion, and so it doesn't have a resident faculty member for the first couple decades of the operation of the university, and so it's kind of administration headquarters.
Kara, you want to go ahead?
I had a question. I don't remember. I guess it was for you,
Okay.
Chris. In those gardens that became living spaces and working spaces, you said smokehouses and things. Were there any animals, chickens, or hogs or anything like that?
Absolutely. We've got abundant evidence of dairy cows. We know that students are constantly complaining about the milking of cows, about the smell and stench from the roving masses of pigs that are running around the Academical Village. One can only assume that they're keeping chickens. And so yes, this is a very lively
And what
landscape.
about dogs and cats?
Dogs and cats. I don't think of immediate references to dogs and cats, but it may be, I mean, surely they're going to be there. The relationship between
Cats wouldn't be inside; they would be
yeah,
barn
outside
or whatever.
keeping,
Yeah, but
keeping the rats down. And the rats, of course, can be running around the privies, which we didn't talk about. Yeah.
were the privies at the back of the gardens, or were they somewhere else outside?
The privies have been one of the most difficult problems for us in our understanding of the landscape. Jefferson's initial plan very clearly has garden structures near the corners, and in instances that's what's been rebuilt in the kind of mid 20th century reimaginings of these spaces, trying to actually identify archaeologically where the privies were located. We know that there were some because there are rules about privies and burning them down and all these kinds of other things, but we have not yet really fully identified the location of a privy.
My question's for Doug about the original idea for the dome. And clearly astronomy was central to Jefferson's idea about, at UVA, and it was a field that was growing at that time. In England, you had Herschel designing these enormous telescopes, new planets were being discovered, or a new planet was discovered. But how did astronomy fit into Jefferson's own intellectual pursuits? I'm not too familiar with him being that well-versed in astronomy himself, so I don't know if you could comment on that.
We know he had a telescope and an orrery at Monticello, and was in contact with several astronomer friends in Philadelphia. So that that pursuit was part of his personal interest. What I don't know, and I haven't studied it, is how intense that pursuit was. It's very clear, though, that he did some deep thinking about it, and that whole effort with the boom lift is an expression of how far he wanted to take that idea. And it's regretful that he didn't come up with a practical solution to using the concave of the dome, in my opinion, because there were other examples in Europe where the dome was used as a blackboard for astronomical pursuit. So it was a part of his personal exploration, but he wasn't able to translate it, at least immediately, at the university.
There's also, just as a side note to that, I was talking to Doug earlier today. I gave a talk a few months ago on the ground that the university was built on. And the initial land purchase consisted of 2 parcels of land. One was where the rotunda and the lawn was built. And then on that same day, he also purchased a second plot of land about a mile to the west for the specific purpose of building an observatory. So right from the outset, an observatory for astronomy was part of the original concept and land purchase of the university. So it was in the foremost top of his mind, even at the very outset of the design.
And not unfittingly, we're on the site of an observatory Jefferson designed from Mont Alto at one point, this conjectural observatory as well. So, all right, one more question? No?
I think my voice is loud enough without microphone. Is that true?
No.
No? Okay. Sorry. I thought it was. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Okay. My question is very simple. Do you know, any of you, I already asked Joe and did not know, which pavilion was assigned to Thomas Cooper? This is assigned in 1819, so it's one of the first pavilions. And I would like you to respond with the old numbers and the new numbers, please. This is a problem we have been trying to solve at the papers for annotation of correspondence. We have been not able to.
So I'm going to teach you how to fish. The best resource on this is Jefferson's University, The Early Life, an increasingly massive database, which is an integration of all of the data that we know about everyday life, faculty, students, et cetera, is dumped into a massive database. It's called Jefferson's University, The Early Life, and there are a number of finding guides that are on the tabs of the Jefferson's University, so the occupancy of every pavilion is outlined since the beginning. At Jefferson's University, Early Life is only concerned up through the 1860s, right? So it's founding to the 1860s. A reference to any student can be found there. You can search by student name. You can also search by cow or privy. And you can also search by the name of a faculty member, and there's a number of key finding guides. And so if you're interested in the history of the university before the Civil War, Jefferson's University, The Early Life, which was initiated by Kurt Von Dock and Maureen McInnes, who I think are in the room, is really it's the gold mine of information.
I think I searched that and wasn't able. One of the problems is that Cooper never comes to UVA, so he's not a faculty.
Ah, well, there you go. Then I can't help you.
All right, and on that hopeful note, I think we probably need a little break before our next session, but thank you all for your wonderful papers.